I'm William F. Bryant, and today I wanted to talk a little bit about interest rates, particularly because interest rates aren't really very well understood by people, and people view interest rates as sometimes evil, to say nothing of the reasons behind it. Now, I'm not going to entirely disagree with that, but for probably a different reason than what you think. So there are reasons that interest rates would be deemed reasonable, and of course, some reasons why interest rates would not be deemed reasonable. Let's start with the reasonable case. So if you were to borrow money from, say, maybe it's not a friend and relative. They always say you shouldn't mix, money and lending and paying back with any kind of friend or relative, because that'll spoil that relationship. So let's just say somebody's willing to borrow you money. And I like using the apple tree example. So you want the money to buy an apple seed. And they're fine with that. They're going to give you that money. And you're going to, of course, plant that apple seed and all of the things that go into it to become a tree and then actually produce apples are all kind of added value over time until you actually get something that grows and sprouts from that you can actually use. So you have a benefit at the end. Now you're going to apply a lot of time to maybe till the soil, add fertilizer, obviously, keep the bugs and pests away as it's trying to grow. You're going to water it. When it starts growing, you want to make sure that it grows nice and straight. And so you might add supports and all kinds of things to help it along the way. And so you kind of nurture this as it goes along. Now, the person who actually loaned you the dollar, from their perspective, they earn that through real labor and real work, most likely as well. They actually had to do something and get compensated for what they had to do. And so that came from their savings. And so because they gave it to you to do something, then they'd like to be compensated back for what they had not been able to do because they gave it to you. So for example, maybe they would have been able to have purchased a certificate of deposit and gotten a certain amount of interest rate from the bank over a certain period of time. Or perhaps they could have used that to buy their own seeds and grow their own apple tree. There are a number of things that you can look at what they could have used to save up to purchase that for their own gain of benefit or value or whatever. So they gave that to you instead. And so to actually look at that and say, yeah, well, I need to compensate you for some of the things that you might have been able to do with it over the time period in which, I used it and I tied it up. And so that person should rightly be compensated. And that's where it's all worked out in the contract beforehand. But perhaps you work out where you're going to grow it and over time, and then you're going to pay it off in apples by the time it's producing apples. And each year you're going to get one apple or something of that sort. But nonetheless, then they can stockpile those seeds, and then they can grow from there. But what the idea is that real labor was put into something, and you're sacrificing what you can do with your savings and giving it to somebody else to do with it. And so you're looking to be compensated for that. And that person is looking at it where, okay, well, this is kind of a risk. So I'm going to give you this that I saved. And what if you're a lousy gardener? What if the tree dies? That once you've exchanged that for that seed and you're trying to grow it, that dollar's pretty much gone. You're all tied into that, either growing it and getting apples, or oops, you default and you can't pay it back. And so the person who gave you the dollar, that's what they're putting into this, and they're sacrificing other things that they may have been able to use that dollar for. So because they're trusting you to be able to do what you can do, and they're kind of risking you not being able to pay them back, they're also risking the amount of time it takes for the tree to produce, because if you're tied into paying back with whatever the tree produces, there's that time that goes into it as well. And then, of course, there's the risk that maybe you didn't use the dollar even to get a seed. Maybe you used the dollar for something else, and you just said that you were going to use it for a seed. So, I mean, there's other risks involved every time somebody gives you an investment or gives you money to use towards something. And this is kind of the idea behind interest rates. The amount of value and time put into something makes something more valuable at the end that somebody else could have also done with it. So your usage of their savings has to be equivalent when you get to the end of the time for that person. Otherwise, they wouldn't give you the dollar. They could have done it themselves. And that's that relationship in interest rates. And of course, interest rates do comprise or are made up of things of that nature. Higher interest rates for more risky investments, or higher, like if you think somebody's not going to be able to pay you back, it's a higher interest rate. That's where you have credit scores and things. The length of time, the amount of money, and whether or not, say that they could. It's a liquidity thing. So perhaps when they gave you that, somebody else says, wow, I really like apples. When they're done, I would love to have your vested interest in those apples that you gave to them. And you think about it and you say, okay, well, I have to wait this long to get it. Well, if you give me $1.50, sure, you can have my interest and I'll sell it to you. And then the other person will think about it and say, okay, yeah, sure, I'll do that. And then, maybe they give you $1.50 for that vested interest. Well, however easy it is to swap out your vested interest in something else, that's kind of the liquidity that's associated with it. And if it's really illiquid, obviously you need more compensation for that in the form of interest rates. And so there are several components that go into whatever your interest rate is. Revolving credit and unsecured credit has higher interest rates as well. You'd know that with credit cards, of course. Those kind of get ridiculous though. But when you actually are trading something that somebody has saved, real labor, real work that has went into it, and it's savings, that's kind of what I consider acceptable interest rates, and you understand how that goes. The crazy thing that we get tied up in our financial system is what I would deem unacceptable. And I mean, it's the system we're in. What do you do? But if you understand how the system works, you're going to be much better intellectually armed for discussions when you talk about real money and like commodity-backed currencies or gold. I know a lot of people have an interest in that, especially now with the inflation that is anticipated to roll through. And so what do I mean by unacceptable? Our financial system is built upon creating money out of thin air. So, I really don't know how many people really even understand this, but initially, you see, and we're in this very gray area. So you can't always say everything is all bad or all good, and it's a very gray area because people then just simply use the system as it is to achieve what it is that they want, whether it is or not that system is a good system or a bad system. You just get by because you don't. I mean, really, if you're one person or a small number, you don't really have a choice in the entire matter. So you just do what you can with it. So that's why I say it's a very rough and very gray area. But the more knowledge you have about it, the more equipped you are to deal with it. Now, when banks actually loan out money, that's how they turn a profit. That's how they make money. They initially were used to hold excess savings because people, when they used real money, when they used gold coins or some kind of a hard commodity-backed system, they didn't want to keep all of their money or all of the representative receipts in one place, because if somebody was to steal them, they would be out all of that actual real labor and savings that they have now put aside. And that's it's not the same as today, where if you call up the bank, they just whoosh, they'll tack on money back in your account. And it really should make you wonder, how that all goes about if they don't ever retrieve the money. But anyway, I mean, that's a side note. Going back to the initial reason for banks. So banks, what they would do is they would charge you a fee for protecting your money. This system was started way back when with the Knights Templar. If you ever want to go back into history, they formed the first banking system where they could write out a note and put a stamp on it, and it would say you could withdraw such and such gold from their other bank that was located, maybe you were in Italy and you were going to withdraw from somewhere in the United Kingdom, and then you could do so. That was kind of the first instance, but once again, it's a piece of paper and a note, and it wasn't your actual real gold. And so there was some amount of safety there. You didn't actually have to carry gold on you, and it was kind of the first ATMs. Well, what would happen, and what happens often, is that the banks wouldn't want to just collect fees from real savings that came in, because it's a very, very small amount. What they would want to do is they would want to loan out the money that was in the bank. However, when that happens, then anything loaned out, once again, goes through all of those things that I said. Anybody they loan it to, it has default risk. Are they going to use it for what they said they were going to use it for? Are they going to be able to pay it back? Who's going to be able to enforce them paying it back? There are a number of issues that go into this, but if it's not the bank's money, they don't care. So they would start loaning it out. And oftentimes people were fine with this until they found out it was their money that was being loaned out without their knowledge. And probably the worst part was that they were not being cut in on the interest that was earned from it. And so those things actually really did happen in history. The people obviously would not be happy with the banks. That's usually what initiated runs on the banks, to have people pull their money out, and then they'd find out that all of their money is gone except for the amount that the bank calculator was withdrawn on a regular basis, and that's all they really actually had on hand. So the banking system would then, it evolved from this, and it would hold people's coin, gold, silver savings, and it would just write out receipts for them. Well, eventually the receipts were traded, and the receipts kind of became like gold because people knew that they were good for gold. And the bank knew that now that the receipts were kind of being taken, that they could stretch it a little bit, just like they had done before, and write out extra receipts for loans, and to create a little extra credit than what they actually had on the books. The fact that government always wants to overspend a budget doesn't hurt, because then government gets wound up and tied into the entire thing, and there's kind of a deal struck that government can borrow and spend more if they make it legal that the receipts are actually exchangeable. And so that's where you kind of have, real rough base exchanges of or the beginnings of a currency system. The thing where we jump in later on is that somewhere in there we get a central banking system which creates money out of thin air and doesn't have any assets. It runs a printing press. There's a reason why they call it the creature from Jekyll Island. But what's even worse is that the banks, when they're tasked in whatever area they're in, however many deposits that they have on hand, they usually loan out as much as they possibly can, because like I said, the only way they make money would be through fees or interest rates on loaning money. Well, what the government then comes in and does is it backs the money that they loan out. so then people allow them to loan it out. But then they approve a system where the banks can loan out multiples of that money that they have on hand, or the amount that has been deposited there, and so once again create money out of thin air. Now they might be able to loan out 10 times what they have on hand, and then of course if they do that, that money might be put into another bank. Well, then that bank counts that as money that it has on hand, and it can do 10 times that, and so on and so on and so on. And so then all of this money is created out of thin air. And of course the bank is able to charge you interest rates on money and basically productivity and goods and labor that it didn't have any part of, and it just created out of thin air. And that's wherein I usually disagree with the system. And that's therein where I usually disagree with the system and say that that's not actually an acceptable method. That type of system then gets out of hand, and that's where you get extreme deficit spending through government, inflation, which is the increasing of the money supply, and it's correlated increase in prices, which reduces the purchasing power of your currency or your dollars. Now, going back to the interest rates now, those things kind of play a huge role in the overall system. The entire principle of finance and money is all cash flows in, cash flows out over time, and then compensated from one side or the other through interest rates. And that's what it all is. I mean, you run your valuations that way, any cash flows going out and commensurate cash flows coming in, all of them are priced and valued in that respect. And all those interest rates are looked at in exactly the same manner that I mentioned. You've got certain portions of an overall interest rate that are comprised of liquidity risk and credit risk, total time, and of course the quote-unquote risk-free rate. And I won't go too deeply into deficit spending and bonds that governments trick people into believing that somehow they're not going to be on the hook for it. But I also wrote an article on inflation, and it's the money printing stupid, so you can definitely read that if you'd like to, and it goes much more in depth to all this. But I did want to mention a little bit about interest rates, and and briefly kind of comment on the fact that not all interest rates are bad. Some are commensurate with what actually happens, but that's when you have the people actually loaning to people. It's labor to labor, and it makes sense over time, not being created out of thin air like the financial system that we have. So that part being said, because it is the financial system that we have, you then have to deal with how it is set up and actually anticipate any changes or how that affects, your cash flows and your financing and any borrowing or investments that you actually do. But because interest rates aren't exactly an exciting and really interesting thing for people to cover, I won't go too deeply into them. I did just want to mention that there are reasons for the concept of interest rates, and there are a number of legitimate pieces that go into interest rates. And if you understand a little bit about what interest rates are comprised of and the way that they are actually used to compare other possibilities of investments from a person's perspective who's actually loaning the money, then you might get a little bit more of an understanding when you actually look at your portfolios and you're looking at interest rates, because they're going to talk about things like the amount of risk that goes into it and the risk that's commensurate with the amount of interest that you're gaining. And of course, the interest that you're gaining in compared to the amount of risk should be exactly the same as any other combination of investments that you could do for the same risk. If it's not, then you need to shuffle around your portfolio so then you actually are getting that. Because if you go back to the apple tree example, remember, if you were going to give that money over to somebody else to actually grow apples and give it back to you, you could have used that money to go and do any other thing that you felt was more or less risky than that apple tree endeavor. But if you actually did do that, you would consider, if it was more risky, well, I want more back for this. If it was less risky, I want, I might not need as much as a riskier investment because I'm guaranteed to get it back. But even with that, you still do have the chance of default that comes along with it. You do have liquidity risk that if you're not able to swap that out to somebody else at whatever time that you want, that's your liquidity risk that goes along with it. You need to be compensated for that. And that's actually something you could consider with your portfolios as well. If you did have to liquidate, how that would affect things, how liquid is your portfolio. But yeah, I don't know. Like I said, interest rates aren't really exciting for most people, and I don't really want to go too far into portfolios or investing or things of that nature. I just wanted to mention interest rates and the fact that there's good and then there's what I've kind of perceived as not good. But if you understand where interest rates come from and kind of how the system works interest rates, which is actually, interestingly enough, the same for whether you consider interest rates good or bad, then you might have a better handling and understanding of how the interest rates are compensatory for credit risk, for example, or just any measures of risk that go along with it. Right at the end here, I might also include that there are a number of times that you'd want to be compensated for inflation risk as well. That basically means that whatever your value is, say, of your portfolio today, it will buy you that inflation increase percentage less in the future if all the prices were to change correspondingly to that increase. That doesn't mean they change in every area exactly the same, but as you can see with the CPI, which I don't really think is an accurate measure of inflation since they take out all the prime living expenses. And so if you follow something like Shadow Stats, which I'm sure a lot of people have heard about by now, and they can calculate out inflation for how it used to be measured before they decided to selectively choose what was in the CPI, you would see that prices are increasing all around the goods and services that people generally would purchase in their everyday lives. And so what that means, obviously, is that if you had $100 and you were able to purchase, certain services and certain goods, before the inflation happened, all of a sudden after the inflation, you have a reduction in the total number of those goods that you can buy after. That's your inflation. That's how it decreases your purchasing power. And that's why they call it a basket of goods, if that has never really been explained and nobody ever really told that to you. And it's for the folks who go grocery shopping, you fill up your basket with cereals and maybe potato chips, soda, whatever you're grabbing along the way, and all of a sudden inflation hits, and 2 weeks later you go back to the grocery store. Well, maybe you can't buy the potato chips anymore, or maybe the potato chips bag is shrunk and you're still paying the same amount for it, but all of a sudden the quantity that you actually have is that percentage of inflation less than what you did 2 weeks ago. And so maybe conceptually that will help people get it. So when you go back into interest rates, then if you're anticipating a time of rising inflation, you would also tack in that interest rate, the amount that you expected inflation to rise. So then the amount that you would get paid back from the interest rate would not reduce your purchasing power, or not by much. You'd already have it bumped up so that you could purchase the same amount that you had, which is another thing to consider, especially during this particular time period that that we're walking into. So hopefully that, I know it didn't go real deep dive in interest rates, but hopefully just conceptually it has you think about them in a different way than maybe you did before, as opposed to just a number with a percentage that you're paying back to somebody, which a lot of people only really see on credit cards, car loans, things of that nature. And I know I didn't really go into effective rates or APR or anything like that, but then that gets a little bit more involved in a lot of the compounding and math aspect, and I don't know if a vast majority of people would be able to understand that. So I mean, in closing, though, I would say that regardless of what is said, math is, if it's hard or not, it is by far your best friend. It is the one language that is universal. All numbers are done and computed the same. It doesn't matter what your base, like spoken language is. Math is math everywhere, and it's the only subject that will actually increase your cognitive ability and your ability to assess situations differently and logically, just because you're sharpening those problem-solving aspects of your mind. And yes, I know that math takes more time for others than maybe for a small few, but it is worth the effort to do it and learn where it comes from, why it's used, what it represents, because then when you actually do go into these other things, you're not taken by the system that's presented to you. The more that you're able to do for yourself, the less you become tied to a system that really doesn't care much for you and would just prefer to use you. But that's my 2 cents on that. So hopefully in this short thing you got something out of it. Thanks for listening.